The radio crackled with static as Technical Sergeant Matthias Corwin pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, his fingers hovering over the transmission key in the cramped communications bunker at Tinian Air Base. August 9, 1945, 7:43 in the morning, and the Pacific dawn was breaking over what would become the most consequential day in human history. Around him, the controlled chaos of a military operation in full swing filled the air with urgent voices, clicking teletype machines, and the distant rumble of B-29 engines warming up on the runway. But Corwin heard something else in the radio chatter, something that made his blood run cold. The weather reconnaissance plane over the primary target had just reported clear skies over Kokura, but Corwin had been monitoring Japanese radio frequencies for the past 6 months, and he knew what the intercepted transmissions really meant. The enemy was expecting them. Every instinct in his body screamed that the mission was walking into a trap, but his orders were crystal clear. Maintain radio silence until the bombers reached their targets. No one in the 5th 09th Composite Group knew that one man's decision to break that silence would determine whether the war ended that day or dragged on for months with unimaginable casualties. Corwin had grown up in the coal mining town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, where his Polish immigrant father worked the dangerous tunnels beneath the earth, and his mother took in laundry to make ends meet. The youngest of 4 brothers, Matthias, had always been the one who noticed things others missed, the boy who could hear the subtle change in a mine shaft's timbers that warned of collapse, who could read the weather in the way birds flew before a storm. When he enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942, his recruiter had been impressed by his acute hearing and natural aptitude for radio equipment, but Corwin's real talent lay deeper than technical skill. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to read between the lines of enemy communications, to hear the fear or confidence in a Japanese operator's voice, to detect the telltale patterns that revealed troop movements or strategic intentions. His commanding officers had quickly recognized this gift, and by 1943, Corwin found himself assigned to the highly classified radio intelligence unit that would eventually become part of the Manhattan Project's security apparatus. He spent countless hours in dimly lit bunkers across the Pacific, headphones clamped to his ears, notebook filled with intercepts and translations, slowly building a mental map of Japanese military communications that would prove invaluable in the final months of the war. His fellow soldiers initially viewed him with suspicion, this quiet kid from Pennsylvania, who seemed to know more about enemy intentions than their own intelligence officers. But Corwin had earned their respect through months of accurate predictions and life-saving warnings. He had no idea that soon those same instincts that had kept his unit alive would force him to make a choice between following orders and preventing a catastrophe that could alter the course of history. The morning of August 9, 1945, found the Pacific theater of World War II at its most critical juncture. 3 days earlier, the atomic bomb codenamed Little Boy had been dropped on Hiroshima, unleashing devastation beyond anything the world had ever witnessed. The Japanese government was reeling from the unprecedented destruction, but military hardliners still controlled key decisions, and surrender seemed far from certain. President Truman and his advisors had authorized the deployment of the second atomic weapon, Fat Man, to force a rapid conclusion to the war and avoid the massive casualties predicted for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Military planners estimated that such an invasion could cost 1 million American lives and potentially 5 million Japanese casualties, making the atomic option appear as the lesser of 2 terrible evils. The primary target for August 9th was Kokura, an industrial city containing one of Japan's largest weapons manufacturing complexes, with Nagasaki designated as the secondary target if weather or other factors prevented the primary strike. At Tinian Air Base in the Mariana Islands, the launching point for both atomic missions, the atmosphere was tense with the weight of history and the knowledge that the actions of the next few hours could determine whether the war ended quickly or dragged on for months. The crew of Boxcar, the B-29 designated to carry Fat Man, had been briefed extensively on their mission parameters, weather contingencies, and communication protocols. But they had no access to the intelligence intercepts that were painting an increasingly ominous picture of Japanese preparations. Only a handful of men like Corwin, monitoring enemy radio traffic from their isolated bunkers, understood that the Japanese military had begun to suspect American intentions and was positioning fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft batteries in ways that suggested foreknowledge of the attack routes and timing. Throughout the early morning hours, Corwin had been tracking an alarming increase in Japanese radio activity around Kokura and the surrounding region. His years of experience had taught him to recognize the subtle patterns that indicated military units moving into defensive positions, and what he was hearing suggested that the Japanese had somehow anticipated the atomic mission and were preparing an unprecedented defensive response. The intercepts spoke of fighter wings being repositioned, anti-aircraft guns being concentrated along likely approach routes, and most troubling of all, what appeared to be preparations for a coordinated kamikaze attack against any incoming bombers. Corwin's Japanese was far from perfect, but he had developed an ear for military terminology and tactical language, and the fragments he was piecing together painted a picture of a massive trap being set for the atomic mission. The weather reconnaissance plane had reported clear skies over Kokura, which should have been good news for the mission, but Corwin knew from the intercepted communications that the clear weather was precisely what the Japanese defenders were counting on. They had positioned their forces to take maximum advantage of visibility conditions, turning what should have been an optimal bombing environment into a potential killing field. His standing orders were explicit and non-negotiable. Radio silence was to be maintained throughout the mission unless specifically authorized by command, and intelligence information was to be processed through proper channels, not broadcast directly to flight crews. But as Corwin listened to the growing volume of enemy preparations, he realized that the normal intelligence chain would be too slow to prevent disaster. The intercepts he was hearing were barely minutes old, describing defensive movements that were happening in real time, and by the time his reports worked their way through the bureaucracy of military intelligence, Boxcar would already be approaching its target. The weight of the decision settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, as he realized that he alone possessed the information that could save the crew and preserve the atomic weapon for a more strategic deployment. But using that information would require him to violate direct orders and potentially face court-martial or worse. The sound of aircraft engines growing louder outside the communications bunker told Corwin that the mission was entering its final preparation phase. In a few minutes, Major Charles Sweeney would taxi Boxcar to the runway and begin the flight that was supposed to end the war. But Corwin's monitoring of Japanese communications had revealed intelligence that could change everything. The enemy intercepts were becoming more frequent and more specific, with references to American bomber formations, altitude estimates, and what appeared to be countdown timing that suggested the Japanese knew far more about the mission than anyone had anticipated. Corwin's notebook was filled with hastily scribbled translations and frequency notations, each entry adding to the growing evidence that Kokura was no longer a viable target. The Japanese had somehow obtained advance warning of the atomic mission, possibly through their own intelligence operations or through pattern recognition of American bomber movements, and they were preparing a reception that could destroy the aircraft carrying the most powerful weapon ever created. The implications were staggering. If Fat Man fell into enemy hands, Japan could potentially reverse engineer atomic technology, prolonging the war indefinitely and shifting the balance of power in ways that defied imagination. Corwin's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his transmitter, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the outcome of the entire war. His fellow radio operators in the bunker were focused on their own assignments, monitoring weather reports and navigation beacons, unaware that their quiet colleague from Pennsylvania was about to make a decision that would rewrite the rules of military engagement. The static in his headphones seemed to grow louder as he prepared to break protocol, but underneath that electronic noise, he could still hear the voices of Japanese pilots and ground controllers coordinating the trap that awaited the American bombers over Kokura. At exactly 7:58 in the morning, with Boxcar beginning its taxi toward the runway, Corwin made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He switched his radio to the emergency frequency used by bomber crews and began transmitting, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. The words came out in the clipped, professional tone he had learned during countless training exercises, but every syllable was a violation of direct orders and a gamble with both his career and his life. He reported the concentrated enemy preparations around Kokura, the intercepted communications indicating advance warning of the mission, and his assessment that the primary target had been compromised. The response from Boxcar's radio operator came immediately, surprise and concern, evident even through the crackling static. But Corwin pressed on with the detailed intelligence he had gathered throughout the morning. He provided specific information about enemy fighter positions, anti-aircraft concentrations, and the timing of Japanese defensive preparations, painting a picture of a coordinated ambush that could destroy the atomic mission before it reached its target. The radio fell silent for several long minutes as the bomber crew processed this unexpected intelligence and presumably consulted with their commanding officers, while Corwin sat in his bunker knowing that he had just committed an act of insubordination that could result in decades in military prison, or worse. But as the minutes ticked by and he continued monitoring Japanese communications, the pattern of enemy preparations became even clearer, confirming his assessment that Kokura had indeed become a trap. The Japanese were moving additional resources into position, their radio chatter reflecting confidence and anticipation that suggested they believed they could capture or destroy the American atomic bomber. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was actually only 12 minutes, Boxcar's pilot acknowledged the intelligence and announced his intention to proceed directly to the secondary target at Nagasaki, bypassing Kokura entirely. The relief that flooded through Corwin's body was quickly replaced by a new anxiety, as he realized that his unauthorized transmission had been monitored by military communications throughout the Pacific, and he would soon face the consequences of his decision to break radio silence. The flight to Nagasaki proceeded without the devastating resistance that would have awaited the bombers over Kokura, and at 11:02 that morning, Fat Man was released over its secondary target, bringing the Pacific War to an effective conclusion. The atomic explosion over Nagasaki, while terrible in its destructive power, was delivered against a target that was not expecting attack, achieving the strategic objective of demonstrating American atomic capability without walking into a prepared ambush that could have resulted in the loss of the weapon and the continuation of the war. Within hours of the bombing, Japanese radio communications intercepted by Corwin and his fellow operators revealed the shock and demoralization that the second atomic attack had produced in enemy military circles, confirming that the psychological impact of the weapon had achieved what months of conventional bombing could not. The intercepts spoke of military commanders arguing for immediate surrender, of civilian leaders demanding an end to the fighting, and of a general collapse in Japanese resolve that made further resistance appear futile. But even as the evidence mounted that the war was effectively over, Corwin found himself facing intense scrutiny from military intelligence officers who wanted to understand how he had obtained such accurate advance warning of Japanese defensive preparations, and why he had chosen to break communication protocols without authorization. The interrogation sessions were thorough and sometimes hostile, with investigators questioning every aspect of his intelligence-gathering methods and demanding detailed explanations of his decision-making process. Corwin answered their questions honestly, providing comprehensive documentation of the intercepts he had made and the analysis that had led to his assessment of the threat to the Kokura mission. He explained his interpretation of Japanese military communications, his recognition of the defensive patterns that indicated advance warning, and his conclusion that immediate action was necessary to preserve both the aircraft and the atomic weapon. The investigators seemed particularly interested in how he had developed such sophisticated understanding of enemy intentions, and Corwin found himself describing years of careful study, language training, and pattern recognition that had gradually built his expertise in Japanese military communications. The official inquiry into Corwin's breach of communication protocol lasted for 3 weeks, during which time he remained confined to base while investigators reviewed every aspect of his service record and interviewed dozens of witnesses to his intelligence work throughout the Pacific Campaign. The testimonies painted a consistent picture of a dedicated and highly skilled radio operator whose unconventional methods had repeatedly provided valuable intelligence that saved American lives and facilitated successful military operations. His commanding officers spoke of his uncanny ability to detect enemy intentions from fragmentary radio intercepts, his accurate predictions of Japanese defensive movements, and his consistent track record of providing actionable intelligence under pressure. Fellow soldiers described instances where Corwin's warnings had prevented ambushes, avoided mined areas, or identified enemy weak points that had been exploited for tactical advantage. The investigators also examined captured Japanese documents that had become available after the surrender, and these revealed that their defensive preparations around Kokura on August 9th had indeed been based on intelligence indicating an imminent American attack of unprecedented importance. The enemy had positioned fighter squadrons, concentrated anti-aircraft batteries, and prepared coordinated responses specifically designed to intercept and destroy incoming bombers, carrying what they suspected might be another atomic weapon. The captured documents confirmed that Corwin's assessment of the threat had been accurate, and that his decision to warn the bomber crew had prevented a potential catastrophe. Moreover, the Japanese intelligence indicated that they had been monitoring American communication patterns for weeks and had detected unusual activity around Tinian Air Base that suggested preparation for another special mission. This revelation highlighted the sophistication of enemy intelligence operations and the real possibility that the Kokura mission could have ended in disaster without Corwin's intervention. The final report from the military investigation acknowledged that while Corwin had technically violated communication protocols, his actions had been based on sound intelligence assessment and had ultimately contributed to the successful conclusion of the atomic bombing campaign. The weeks following Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, brought profound changes to military operations throughout the Pacific, but for Corwin, the personal consequences of his decision were still unfolding. Rather than facing court-martial as he had expected, he found himself quietly reassigned to a special intelligence unit tasked with analyzing captured Japanese communications equipment and documents to better understand enemy intelligence capabilities. This assignment represented both recognition of his expertise and a form of protective custody that removed him from normal military channels, while his superiors decided how to handle his unauthorized actions. The work was fascinating and revealed the extent to which Japanese forces had been monitoring American communications, intercepting strategic planning discussions, and developing sophisticated methods for predicting Allied military operations. Corwin's ability to read between the lines of enemy communications proved invaluable in this reverse intelligence operation, as he helped identify which American communication methods had been compromised and which had remained secure throughout the war. The captured documents also revealed that Japanese intelligence had indeed detected preparations for a second atomic mission and had specifically concentrated defenses around Kokura, based on their analysis of American bomber patterns and radio traffic. This confirmation vindicated Corwin's assessment and demonstrated that his decision to break communication protocol had been based on accurate intelligence rather than unfounded suspicion. However, the official recognition of his contribution remained classified, and he was warned that the details of the August 9th mission would remain secret for decades to come. His fellow soldiers began to treat him with a mixture of respect and wariness, recognizing that he had somehow been involved in events of tremendous importance, but uncertain about the exact nature of his role. The letters from home spoke of celebration and relief that the war was over, but Corwin found himself unable to share the details of how he had contributed to that victory, carrying the weight of his decision and its consequences in solitude. The months that followed brought gradual acknowledgement within military intelligence circles that Corwin's unauthorized transmission had prevented a potential disaster that could have changed the course of history. Senior officers who had initially criticized his breach of protocol began to recognize that his deep understanding of enemy communications and his willingness to act on tactical intelligence had saved both the atomic weapon and the lives of the bomber crew. The captured Japanese documents revealed detailed plans for coordinating multiple fighter squadrons against incoming American bombers, with specific emphasis on capturing rather than destroying aircraft carrying special weapons. The enemy strategy had been sophisticated and well coordinated, suggesting that they understood the strategic value of atomic technology and were prepared to risk significant resources to prevent its use or to capture it for their own purposes. Analysis of the defensive preparations around Kokura indicated that the bombers would have faced unprecedented resistance, including coordinated kamikaze attacks designed to disable rather than destroy the aircraft, followed by ground operations to secure any wreckage and recover the weapon. The implications of such a scenario were staggering. Successful Japanese capture of Fat Man could have provided them with atomic technology that might have prolonged the war for years and fundamentally altered the post-war balance of power. Corwin's decision to warn the bomber crew had not only saved lives, but had prevented a potential catastrophe that could have reshaped the 20th century. Military planners began incorporating lessons learned from the August 9th mission into new communication protocols, recognizing that rigid adherence to radio silence could sometimes conflict with the need for real-time intelligence assessment. The incident also highlighted the importance of experienced radio operators who could interpret enemy intentions from fragmentary communications, leading to enhanced training programs and improved coordination between intelligence gathering and operational units. In December of 1945, Corwin received a private commendation from General Curtis LeMay, who acknowledged that his actions had contributed significantly to the successful conclusion of the Pacific War, though the specific details of that contribution would remain classified. The commendation cited his exceptional intelligence work throughout the Pacific Campaign and his consistent dedication to protecting American forces through accurate assessment of enemy capabilities and intentions. LeMay's letter noted that successful military operations often required individuals willing to exercise judgment under pressure and to take responsibility for decisions that went beyond strict adherence to protocol. The general emphasized that while military discipline remained essential, there were rare circumstances where individual initiative and expertise could prevent catastrophic failures of command and intelligence. Corwin's case was to be studied privately within military intelligence circles as an example of how experienced operators could provide critical real-time assessment that formal intelligence channels might miss or delay. However, The public recognition that Corwin had hoped for never materialized, as the details of the atomic missions remained highly classified, and his role in redirecting the August 9th bombing was considered too sensitive for public disclosure. He was quietly transferred to a peacetime intelligence assignment in Washington, where his expertise in communication intercepts was applied to emerging Cold War challenges involving Soviet radio traffic and nuclear weapons development. The transition from the intensity of wartime operations to the routine of peacetime bureaucracy proved difficult, and Corwin found himself struggling with the knowledge that his most significant contribution to military history would likely remain secret for decades. Letters from former colleagues spoke of their return to civilian life, marriage, and new careers, but Corwin felt trapped between the classified nature of his wartime service and the uncertainty of his future in a rapidly changing military structure. The years immediately following the war brought personal challenges as Corwin attempted to build a civilian life while carrying the weight of classified knowledge and unresolved questions about his military service. He married Helena Nowak, a nurse from Philadelphia whom he met during his intelligence assignment in Washington, and they settled in a small house in suburban Maryland, where he could commute to his work at the Pentagon. Helena understood that her husband had been involved in important but secret work during the war, and she respected his inability to discuss the details while providing the emotional support he needed to transition to peacetime life. Their first child, a daughter they named Catherine, was born in 1947, followed by a son, Michael, in 1949, and Corwin found that fatherhood provided a sense of purpose and continuity that helped balance the isolation he felt regarding his wartime experiences. His work in Cold War intelligence was challenging and important, but it lacked the immediate life-or-death urgency that had characterized his Pacific service, and he sometimes felt that he was simply going through the motions of a career that had already reached its most significant moment. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 brought a brief return to the intensity of wartime intelligence work, as Corwin's expertise in interpreting fragmentary communications proved valuable in understanding Soviet intentions and refugee movements. But even this crisis felt distant compared to the personal responsibility he had carried during the atomic missions. In quiet moments, usually late at night while his family slept, Corwin would sometimes wonder about the alternative history that might have unfolded if he had followed protocol on August 9, 1945, and maintained radio silence while Bockscar flew into the trap awaiting it over Kokura. The captured Japanese documents had made clear that the enemy defenses were sophisticated and determined, designed not just to destroy incoming bombers, but to capture atomic technology that could have changed the entire trajectory of the post-war world. During the 1960s, as Cold War tensions escalated and nuclear weapons became central to global strategy, Corwin began to receive occasional visits from military historians and intelligence analysts who were conducting classified reviews of wartime operations. These interviews provided him with opportunities to discuss the events of August 9, 1945 in detail, though always within the constraints of ongoing secrecy requirements. The analysts were particularly interested in his methods for interpreting enemy communications, his decision-making process under pressure, and his assessment of how similar situations might be handled in future conflicts. Corwin found these discussions both validating and frustrating, as they confirmed the significance of his wartime contributions while highlighting the continuing prohibition against public recognition of his role. The historians explained that declassification of atomic mission details would require decades of careful review, as many aspects of nuclear weapons development and deployment remained sensitive to ongoing strategic considerations. They assured him that his service record would eventually be released and that his contributions would be acknowledged, but the timeline remained indefinite and subject to changing political and security considerations. Meanwhile, Corwin's children grew up knowing that their father had served with distinction during World War II, but unaware of the specific nature of his contributions or the weight of responsibility he had carried. Helena sometimes noticed the distant look that would cross her husband's face when news reports discussed nuclear weapons or military strategy, but she respected his privacy and focused on building the stable family life that provided him with emotional anchor. The suburban routine of Little League games, school events, and neighborhood gatherings helped normalize Corwin's existence. But he remained conscious of carrying knowledge that had shaped history while being unable to share that knowledge with those closest to him. The social upheavals of the late 1960s and early 70s brought new perspectives on military service and nuclear weapons that sometimes made Corwin question the choices he had made decades earlier. The anti-war protests during the Vietnam conflict included criticism of atomic weapons and the military decision-making that had led to their use against Japan, and Corwin found himself defending actions that he could not fully explain or discuss publicly. His children, now teenagers, asked pointed questions about nuclear weapons and American foreign policy that forced him to articulate his beliefs about military service and national defense without revealing the personal experience that had shaped those beliefs. Catherine and Michael knew their father had been involved in intelligence work during World War II, but they viewed that service through the lens of 1960s idealism that questioned military authority and government secrecy. Family dinners sometimes became tense discussions about American involvement in Southeast Asia, nuclear deterrence strategy, and the morality of weapons of mass destruction, with Corwin defending positions that were based on classified knowledge and personal experience that he could not share. Helena often intervened to redirect these conversations toward less contentious topics, understanding that her husband was struggling to reconcile his wartime experiences with changing social attitudes toward military service. The generational divide was particularly painful for Corwin because he could not explain that his own decision to break military protocol had been motivated by humanitarian concerns similar to those expressed by his children, though arriving at different conclusions about the necessity of decisive action under extreme circumstances. The irony was not lost on him that he had violated military orders to prevent a catastrophe that could have prolonged the war and increased casualties, yet he was now seen by some as a representative of unquestioning military authority. In 1975, exactly 30 years after the end of World War II, Corwin received notification that portions of his service record were being considered for declassification as part of a broader review of wartime intelligence operations. The prospect of finally being able to discuss his contributions openly brought both excitement and anxiety, as he had grown accustomed to carrying his secrets in silence and was uncertain how public revelation might affect his family and his carefully constructed post-war life. The declassification process proved to be lengthy and frustrating, with multiple reviews and redactions that removed many of the most significant details while preserving the general outline of his intelligence work. When portions of his record were finally released in 1977, they confirmed his involvement in critical radio intelligence operations throughout the Pacific Campaign, but provided only limited details about the events of August 9, 1945, and his role in redirecting the atomic mission. The sanitized version of his service record acknowledged his expertise in Japanese communications intercept and his contribution to successful military operations, but avoided specific mention of unauthorized transmissions or protocol violations. For Corwin, this partial recognition was both gratifying and disappointing, as it validated his military service while still concealing the most significant decision of his wartime career. Local newspapers in Maryland and Pennsylvania published brief articles about his distinguished service record, noting his contributions to Pacific Theater intelligence operations and his post-war work in government service, but these accounts provided no hint of the dramatic circumstances that had defined his most important moment as a soldier. Friends and neighbors who had known him for decades were surprised to learn of his wartime exploits, having viewed him simply as a quiet government worker who kept to himself and rarely discussed his past. Helena and the children finally understood why their husband and father had sometimes seemed burdened by knowledge he could not share, though even the declassified information provided only a partial glimpse of what he had experienced and the weight of responsibility he had carried. The 1980s brought retirement from government service and new opportunities for Corwin to reflect on his wartime experiences, as he began writing detailed memoirs that might eventually be published when full declassification became possible. He spent hours in his home office, carefully documenting his memories of August 9, 1945, and the intelligence work that had led to his crucial decision to break radio silence. The process of writing helped him organize thoughts and feelings that had remained largely unexpressed for 4 decades, and he found himself gaining new perspective on events that had seemed impossibly complex at the time. The memoir revealed not just the technical details of intelligence gathering and communication intercept, but also the personal struggle of a young man from small-town Pennsylvania who found himself carrying responsibility for decisions that could affect the outcome of history. Corwin wrote about the coal mining community where he had grown up, the values of hard work and personal responsibility that had shaped his character, and the way those values had influenced his decision to act on intelligence that suggested the Kokura mission was compromised. He described the months of training and experience that had given him expertise in Japanese military communications, the gradual development of his ability to interpret enemy intentions from fragmentary radio intercepts, and the growing confidence in his analytical skills that had enabled him to recognize the threat facing the atomic mission. The memoir also explored the personal cost of carrying classified knowledge for decades, the isolation that came from being unable to share significant experiences with family and friends, and the complex emotions involved in knowing that his greatest contribution to military history would likely remain secret long after his death. Writing became a form of therapy that helped him process experiences that had been largely unexamined due to secrecy constraints, and he found himself developing new appreciation for the choices he had made under pressure and the consequences that had flowed from those decisions. As the 20th century drew to a close, Corwin began receiving requests for interviews from military historians who were conducting comprehensive reviews of World War II intelligence operations for eventual scholarly publication. These historians had access to recently declassified Japanese documents that provided unprecedented insight into enemy intelligence capabilities and defensive preparations during the final months of the war. The Japanese materials confirmed many of Corwin's wartime assessments and revealed the sophistication of enemy efforts to intercept American communications and predict military operations. Most significantly, the captured documents detailed the extensive preparations around Kokura on August 9, 1945, including specific plans for coordinating fighter attacks against incoming bombers and ground operations to secure any wreckage from special weapons. The historians explained that Japanese intelligence had indeed detected patterns in American bomber operations that suggested preparation for another atomic mission, and they had concentrated significant defensive resources around the most likely targets based on their analysis of American communication intercepts and reconnaissance flights. The enemy had been particularly interested in capturing rather than destroying aircraft carrying atomic weapons, recognizing the strategic value of the technology and the potential for reverse engineering nuclear capabilities that could change the balance of the war. The historians noted that successful Japanese capture of an atomic weapon would have provided them with insights into American nuclear technology that might have enabled them to develop their own weapons, fundamentally altering the post-war international order. Corwin's decision to warn the bomber crew had prevented not just the loss of the aircraft and its personnel, but potentially catastrophic consequences for American strategic superiority and the rapid conclusion of the Pacific War. The interviews with historians provided Corwin with external validation of assessments he had made instinctively under extreme pressure, confirming that his interpretation of enemy communications had been accurate and his decision to act on that intelligence had been strategically sound. By the dawn of the 21st century, with most participants in World War II operations having passed away, military historians began calling for complete declassification of remaining atomic mission records to preserve historical accuracy and honor the contributions of individuals whose service had remained secret for over 50 years. Corwin, now in his late 70s, became an advocate for this declassification process, arguing that the full story of how the war had ended deserved to be told while surviving participants could still provide first-hand accounts and context. He participated in oral history projects sponsored by military museums and academic institutions, providing detailed accounts of his intelligence work and his role in the events of August 9, 1945, for eventual public release when security restrictions were lifted. These interviews revealed not just the technical aspects of his work, but the human dimension of intelligence operations and the personal responsibility carried by individuals whose decisions could affect the lives of thousands. Corwin spoke about the loneliness of carrying classified knowledge, the difficulty of making life or death decisions without time for a consultation or review, and the long-term psychological impact of knowing that his actions had influenced the course of history. He also discussed the broader implications of his experience for understanding how military operations actually function, noting that successful outcomes often depend on individuals willing to exercise judgment and take responsibility beyond the strict limits of their orders. The oral histories provided rich material for future scholars while preserving Corwin's unique perspective on events that had shaped the modern world but remained largely hidden from public view. His detailed recollections of Japanese radio communications, enemy defensive preparations, and the intelligence assessment process offered insights into wartime decision-making that formal military records could not capture, demonstrating how individual expertise and intuition could provide critical advantages in complex and rapidly changing situations. Matthias Corwin passed away peacefully in 2008, surrounded by his family but still carrying knowledge that had never been fully disclosed to the public. His funeral was attended by former colleagues from his intelligence career, military historians who had interviewed him for classified projects, and neighbors who had known him simply as a quiet man who had served his country with distinction. The eulogies spoke of his dedication to family, his integrity in government service, and his contributions to military intelligence. But even these tributes could not capture the full significance of his wartime role or the weight of responsibility he had carried throughout his life. Helena spoke about her husband's sense of duty and his commitment to protecting others, noting that he had never sought recognition for his service, but had always taken pride in knowing that his work had made a difference during critical moments in American history. Catherine and Michael shared memories of a father who had taught them the importance of making difficult decisions based on principle rather than convenience, though they acknowledged that they were only beginning to understand the personal experiences that had shaped those lessons. The memorial service included representatives from various military and intelligence organizations who recognized Corwin's contributions within the constraints of ongoing classification requirements, offering condolences that hinted at significance they could not fully explain. In the months following his death, his family began the process of organizing his papers and memoirs for eventual donation to military archives, hoping that future declassification might allow his full story to be told and his contributions to be properly recognized. The memoir he had spent decades writing provided detailed documentation of his intelligence work and personal reflections on the moral and practical challenges of wartime service, offering future historians a unique window into the human dimension of military operations that had shaped the modern world. His legacy remained largely hidden from public view, known only to family members, former colleagues, and historians who understood the significance of his role, but were bound by continuing secrecy requirements. The story of Matthias Corwin's decision on August 9, 1945, represents more than just a single act of military disobedience. It illustrates the complex relationship between individual judgment and institutional authority during moments of historical crisis. His willingness to break communication protocol when he recognized that enemy preparations threatened the atomic mission demonstrated how personal expertise and moral responsibility could sometimes conflict with military discipline, forcing individuals to choose between following orders and preventing potential catastrophe. The intelligence he had gathered through months of careful monitoring revealed that rigid adherence to planned operations could sometimes walk directly into enemy traps, and that successful military outcomes often required real-time assessment and adaptive decision-making that formal command structures might be too slow to provide. Corwin's background as the son of immigrants who had worked dangerous jobs to build better lives for their families had instilled values of personal responsibility and practical problem-solving that served him well when faced with the enormous responsibility of protecting both the atomic weapon and the bomber crew carrying it. His decision proved that ordinary individuals from small-town America could rise to extraordinary challenges when circumstances demanded decisive action based on expertise, courage, and moral conviction. The fact that his contribution remained classified for decades after the war demonstrated both the sensitive nature of atomic operations and the way that individual heroism could be hidden within larger historical narratives, known only to those directly involved and to historians with access to classified materials. His story raises important questions about how democratic societies balance the need for military secrecy with the recognition of individual contributions to national security, and how ordinary people can find themselves carrying knowledge and responsibility that shapes the course of history while remaining largely unknown to the public they serve. The choice he made in that communications bunker on Tinian Air Base continues to resonate because it represents the kind of moral courage that democratic institutions depend upon but cannot always officially acknowledge or reward. Would you have broken the order that morning, knowing that your decision could save lives but end your military career? Or would you have maintained protocol and hoped that others would somehow recognize the danger in time? The mathematics of that moment were stark and unforgiving. One man's knowledge against institutional authority, individual assessment against official planning, personal responsibility against military discipline. Corwin chose to act on intelligence that others might have dismissed or delayed, and his decision prevented a potential catastrophe that could have changed the entire trajectory of the 20th century. His story reminds us that history often turns on individual moments of courage and judgment when ordinary people must choose between safety and responsibility, between following orders and following conscience. Share this story with others who understand that true heroism often remains hidden from public view, carried quietly by individuals who made impossible choices during humanity's darkest hours. Comment below and tell us about the unsung heroes in your own family or community, those who made difficult decisions that saved lives or prevented disasters while never seeking recognition for their courage. Remember that the freedom we enjoy today was preserved by people like Matthias Corwin, who understood that sometimes the greatest service to your country requires the courage to disobey orders when conscience and expertise demand it.